Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm very glad to having been invited by Richter. I feel very honored. As he said, I'm not a musicologist. Maybe sometimes I will use some medical term you might not understand, so please interrupt me. The topic of my talk is easy, or very basic. Why did music and dance involve? And it's so basic that there's still an unsolved mystery. So I asked myself how we could tackle this simple question. And I think the first thing which is really important is to define what do we exactly mean when we talk about music and what do we mean when we talk about dance. Once established the attributes of music and dance, then we can ask ourselves also if music and dance are only human or if animals have musical capacities. And on the other hand, if all humans are musical, or at least all human societies. This is what usually is called a human universal. And at the end, not at the end, further, we should ask ourselves, or would like to ask ourselves, how old are the earliest proofs of music and dance in human beings, and how this might be reflected in the development of our individual musical and dancing skills inside our mother's body, so-called womb, and during our lifetime. So the most basic attribute of music and dance is synchrony. You see here footprints, and if you look carefully, you see that these footprints have a completely different size, but the step length is the same. So these two individuals, although they had a completely different size, probably were walking in a lockstep. But is this already music? Is this already written? If you just listen to that, no, that is not music. Music is. So it's much more complicated, complex, and much more joyful than just marching. So what are the other attributes of rhythm? It's not only synchrony, but so-called rhythmical hierarchy. So for example, you can have the same synchrony beat, but you can have it as a meter of 3/4 or 4, and so on and so on. So there's much more possibilities of variations, and you can have the offbeats and the downbeats, and this applies interestingly to both music and dance. And for us, rhythm and dance are two sides of the same coin. Why I'm saying so? If you look at our physiology, you would see that Rizzolatti has discovered that there are neurons who respond to any kind of stimulus. No? Usually these are the sensory neurons, sense, but some of them are the so-called mirror motor neurons. So it means we see something, or we perceive a rhythm, and then our motoric neurons also fire. And if you look carefully at yourself, you would notice that if you have a really groovy rhythm, you have the tendency to spontaneously move without even your control. This is reflected by the very old rock and roll. I can't sit still when I hear the hippie shake. I can't sit still. And so rhythm and dance, in our opinion, is basically one single phenomenon. And if you see and look carefully to very rhythmical musical traditions like samba, flamenco, rumba, and so on, these words apply to both dance and the rhythm. On the other hand, attributes of music include also the musical, the melodic aspect, which is usually organized by musical scale. It could have followed the evolution of so-called motheries. I will talk about that maybe a little bit later. And what's interesting is that musical scales are somehow universal, but not all the aspects are universal. And polyphony is also not a human universal as it is a simultaneous harmony. It is not a universal, a human universal. And you see all these attributes of music and dance. I would like just to draw your attention on the phenomena, on the attributes written in yellow. Because they're highlighted in yellows because these are human universals, and that induces us to say that are probably the fundamenta, the grounds, the basics of rhythm and dance and music. So are we the only ones who are musical? We know that quite a number of animals can display synchronization, or even fireflies. And here you see the famous snowball cockatoo, who moves rhythmically to an external rhythm, but they cannot stratify beats into a musical rhythm. And that applies also to our most close genetic relatives, the chimpanzees. And on these pictures, I'm showing you some particularity of the difference between us and the chimpanzees. That is that the chimpanzees and the bonobos usually use the so-called knuckle walk, and only very rarely they go on 2 feet only. So if we look to the questions, since when there is musical behavior in hominids, then again we come back to these footprints we have seen before. These are the so-called Laetoli footprints, and there are footprints of our most ancient pre-hominids, so-called Australopithecus afarensis, the first who went on 2 feet. That is the first with habitual bipedal gait. And that's more than 3 million years ago, but that's only synchrony. If you look at proofs of musical and dancing behavior later, there are no longer or no other proofs than artifacts found in South Germany, in the Geistenkloster, where the oldest flutes were found, and some rock art, but they are rather recent, so 40,000 years ago. However, if you look, for example, I don't know if you know, cantejondo or flamenco is done only by singing and clapping hands and stepping feet, and is a quite complicated musical tradition which doesn't need any musical instrument, so it would not leave any artifact, any thing to be found by archaeologists. So thinking about the sentence of Ernst Haeckel more than 100 years ago, he has seen, he was an embryologist, that ontogenesis partially recapitulates phylogenesis. That means our own embryonal development remembers stages of our phylogenesis when we were vertebrates. You see the human embryo on the right side of the left table displays gills like in fish. So this shows that our human embryos remember our development, our evolution, even from before we were mammals. So with this right, we look also into what happens inside the uterus before we are born. And Richard Pankotti has shown since a long time that human and private fetuses can perceive a lot of stimuli inside the uterus, inside the womb. And I have put here which are the rhythmical ones and which are not the rhythmical ones. The heartbeat, the breathing of the mother are clearly rhythmical. The intestinal peristalsis is not, and the voice may be or maybe not rhythmical. But what do only human fetuses perceive and not the non-human primates? This is the bipedal regular footstep sound of the mother, and the fetus is rocked to this bipedal footsteps. So this is a very strong stimulus, and it's multimodal. It's not just to hear and not just for the ear, but it's the whole body which is shaped or rocked in this rhythm. And maybe some human mothers also dance. This is now a mother who has already but you can imagine that before, when she was pregnant, probably she also kept dancing, and clearly also the language and the intonation. And these are rhythmical. So why footsteps have so far been relatively neglected? It's probably because the most sound experiments were done in animals who are not walking on 2 feet only, or in mothers to be who were not walking. So if we imagine when we are born how traumatic that must be, you can imagine the first thing we do usually in our life is to cry if we are healthy. And what can soothe us? Clearly breastfeeding will soothe us, but on the other question is, what would be the best soothing method? And most probably, and that's the question we want to ask answer later, is that rocking a baby is maybe a very efficient way to soothe a baby. I think all parents agree on that, but we will see that later. What do we know already? The research group of Henk-Jan Honing has done a very, very interesting and elegant experiment, putting EEG cables on the heads of newborns, and there you can follow exactly how they perceive a rhythm. And the interesting thing is what the newborns did and what the signals did to induce them. That means the researchers gave a signal that was rhythmical, like regular, and the newborns, they peaked with it. But the interesting thing is then that the researchers interrupted sometimes this speed. They're doing. What did the newborns do? They peaked as there was no interruption. That means they are able to anticipate the next beat of an internal rhythm. And that's the ground, the basics of any kind of rhythm, of dance and music. And another very interesting experiment has been done by Philip Silver and a trainer. If you bounce infants and toddler in a special rhythm, that's to say every 3 or every 4 beats, then these children later would prefer an interpretation of an arbitrary rhythm in 3 or 4 quarters. And if you make children drum, then they will be more social. And there are other, this is just one of these experiments, but there are many more showing that music, even from very, very young age on, is a very social thing. And a Swiss and Finnish research group has shown that toddlers have a spontaneous impulse to dance. Anyhow, our question was, is this dance impulse universal, or it's just applying to Finnish and Swiss children? And if this is universal, in which moment would it emerge? And are there a difference between healthy children and children with disorders that would say that a dancing impulse could be one of the tests for healthy development in infants and toddlers? So this is I'm showing what I'm talking about.
Tell Mama how to dance.
Even this, for example, probably doesn't not yet know how to work on 2 feet. So what did we do to investigate this issue? We asked parents of children about some general questions in order not to put them too much on the dance impulse, around the dance impulse, about their development and about when they're working, talking, how they would soothe a baby, rather by singing or rather by rocking the baby, and so on. So these questions were a little bit scattered around in order not to influence the parents. And now we are looking for the result. We had no idea what would come out, so it was a completely open research question, and we were by ourselves surprised of the result. So at the end, we had more than 1,000 parents of more than 1,000 children asked, and they came from 70. The parents came from 76 countries of 5 continents, and these results were also compared with results in children who have developmental disturbances, but this for today is not so important. So the most interesting thing is what the dance impulse was reported by almost all parents of all children. That was for us surprising. That means it doesn't depend on any culture. It's an innate reflex. And it arose more or less at the same, or emerged at the same time, more or less at talking even before walking, and much earlier than singing. So this is just for comparison. I will not go into detail, but it's also indicating a healthy development of the child. So what does that mean? Contrary to what people usually think, is every human being, and it doesn't depend on its culture, has rhythm in the blood. So to underscore this finding, we were also asking the parents what would they do for soothing their children. I'll show you a movie I made yesterday. You see this mother? You hear the child crying. After some a little bit everywhere. So what did the parents answer us? And they say 85% opted for rocking, and the parents who did so less than the others were especially the African, because they had already their children on the back. So probably the figure would even be more important. But all this dance and music stuff, what is this good for? If you look in the wilderness, if you sing and you dance and you drum, and you are so concentrated on what you are doing, that could be really dangerous, and it expends also energy, and you have to look how you get your calories in the wilderness. And so it's not that obvious that it would be an advantage to dispose of musical skills. On the other hand, we have already seen that synchronizing is not only a human behavior, but it is a very interesting and very important thing, especially because we are a very, very cooperative species, or even more cooperation is our survival secret in evolution. Already Darwin had observed or had hypothesized that dancing is an important signaling for mating purposes, and not only for individually, but also if you look at what happens in hunter and gatherer societies, there are usually small groups which sometimes meet and they do a party together, and in these situations they need to dance also because there is no language issue. Dancing and music is understood by people who speak different languages, and that's also one of the advantages of dancing music, and it's a very, very important social glue, especially in traditional societies, and maybe even before the advent of language, it is also a very potent and emotional extraverbal communication. It means this is embodied. That means we feel it much stronger than just language, and that kind of communication has been called by Stephen Mitten the language, or the holistic, multimodal, manipulative, and musical means of communication. Similar to other animals, dancing can also be used for apparent fights in order to avoid real fights and deadly duels. So by dancing, you can show your skills, and the other potential enemy sees, oh no, I better don't get in a real fight with this guy. And it's also clearly, especially in societies there's no TV and all these other things, it is a risk factor. Boredom is a risk factor for violence and also for suicide. So dance prevents boredoms, and this way also prevent murder. And individually, dancing is clearly very helpful for learning and for coordinating movements, either to internal or external stimuli. Music and dance are clearly good painkillers, and they elevate the pain threshold, as you see in this guy. And in my own experience, I had a very bad accident, and I can tell you that by music, I have reduced the need of painkillers a lot just by listening to music or by moving as I was training some dance movement. It's also antidepressive, and George Steiner has observed that the only thing we really cannot stop besides by sleeping is thinking. And so for not thinking, we know we need to divert our attention, and this we do best by so-called flow experiences, and music and dance are this kind of experiences. So they divert us completely, we're concentrated, and we don't think so much in our sorrows. And rhythmical understanding is also necessary for encoding speech. So it may have also had a very important place in language evolution. So summarizing, we had some phylogenetic finding. The synchronization was present as soon as hominids regularly displayed the bipedal gait. Only humans have the full capacity of extracting. I don't know why this, hopefully I will not be interrupted because there is no light in this room here, or no electricity. Only humans have the full capacity of rhythm and dance, and they contribute to a better survival of children and encourage sexual mating. And they paved the way for music and language evolution. And in our life, maternal bipedal gait is a very potent stimulus, and this is why maybe we are so susceptible to this kind of movements, and that may soothe us. And this is why we have the dance impulse. And you see this little bit. I'm talking now more quickly because I'm afraid that there will be an electricity cut. Descending from the trees, you see all this, how that will end up in better survival and reproduction success. And again.
So in your survey, you found out that I believe 99% of parents said that their children dance spontaneously.
Yes.
And you said the average age was what when they start dancing?
11 months.
Okay. And so We have a question about that. So why are they doing that at 11 months?
Why are they doing?
Yeah, how would you explain the origin of this spontaneous dancing urge?
As a kind of auto-soothing effect.
Why is it soothing?
Because inside, when a mother-to-be is walking, everything is fine.
Okay, so it's like going back to the womb.
Yes.
And so this is part of your theory. Anything that makes you feel like you go back to the womb is soothing?
Yeah, back to a womb of, let's say, of a healthy mother.
Okay, and how can you, that's not really memory in the normal sense of memory?
No, not the normal sense. You know what? Our memory is limited. We interestingly, we forget almost 3 years after birth, and many people who think that remember something earlier, they have, somebody has told them, and then they have it. The memory is so strong that they think that they remembered it, but the memory researchers say that the really reminding is from 3 years on only.
Okay, so you're talking about the absence of episodic memory before 3 years of age.
Yes.
But there is maybe something called implicit memory.
Exactly.
Or procedural memory. Is that the word you would
Yes.
use? Procedural memory. All right. So we have a group of excited audience members here who maybe want to ask a question. I've got a microphone which I can give to them. Someone ask a question, please. Bernd wants to ask a question. He's about to take the microphone.
Well, I would like to ask you, thank you for your presentation first. I would like to ask you if ever anybody tested if mothers who walked more during pregnancy.
Very good idea.
Birth to
No,
less
not yet.
more musical children. But this
Not
would
yet.
be very easy and before, well.
Yeah. Anyhow, I'm not completely sure. This is so individually to see so individually. Let's say if maybe this memory is even kind of already of a kind of phylogenetic memory. So I could even imagine that even children of mothers who do not work display a dance impulse. That would not be for me a complete contradiction.
Yes, but that sounds very speculative to me, actually.
I can tell you another example. If you ask people worldwide how they would say what we in German say "au" to some, if they have some pain, we look for that in deaf people, and although they don't hear anything, they do something very similar to all human beings. That they say they start their pain interjection with a vocal. They say "oh," maybe something like that. So it's an interesting thing to look at, but I would not be surprised if even children of non-working mothers have a kind of a dance impulse.
Okay, I didn't really understand your response due to technical
There's you have an individual remembering, but there's also a kind of phylogenetic remembering. That's to say, a species is walking since millions of years using the bipedal gait. So there are connections in the brain which may be inborn. So it would not be a complete surprise of me that even children who are born to non-working mothers display the dance impulse. I think it's so old phylogenetically that it's not a just individual thing.
So it would
Anyhow,
be
it's
genetic.
good and interesting to look at.
Then, as far as I understand, then it would be genetically transmitted.
Yeah, I'm fair so. It's like you have also genetic basis for language.
So I guess you're talking about an interaction between genetics and culture or behavior. So like an interaction between nature and nurture explanations.
Yeah.
As a medical researcher, how would you talk about that? What's the terminology we should use?
No, we just look if it's genetic, if it's heritage, or if it's acquired.
Okay, that was really very interesting. I found your talk quite fascinating, and I would like to thank you for taking your time to give it to us. We have to move on to the second talk in our session. So thank you very much. The audience is about to clap.
I have to.
So we wish you a pleasant evening in Senegal.
Thank you very much, and excuse me for the interruption, but anyhow.
That's fine.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a nice evening. Bye.
Have a good time.